The loudest voice in the room rarely belongs to the strongest person. Sometimes, true power arrives as a whisper no one is prepared to answer. The crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble as expensive conversations drifted through Blackstone House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where every reservation came with a waiting list measured in months rather than days. Fine china clinked softly. A pianist filled the room with quiet jazz. Waiters moved with practiced precision between white linen tables, each step almost invisible, each smile carefully measured. Then everything stopped. The sharp sound of a man's voice sliced through the elegant atmosphere like shattered glass. "Is this your idea of professional service?" Ethan Blackwood's words echoed against the high ceiling. Every fork paused halfway to every plate. Every conversation dissolved into silence. The billionaire stood beside his table, 6 feet of tailored confidence wrapped inside a charcoal Italian suit that probably cost more than some families earned in a month. His steel blue eyes never left the young waitress standing before him. Claire Bennett didn't step backward. She didn't lower her head. She simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the leather order book she carried, her expression calm enough to make the entire room uncomfortable. Around them, guests exchanged nervous glances. Some quietly reached for their phones before thinking better of it. Others stared into their wine glasses, pretending not to notice the public humiliation unfolding only a few feet away. The restaurant manager hurried across the dining room, already rehearsing an apology. Everyone in Manhattan knew Ethan Blackwood. Venture capitalist, billionaire, builder of companies, destroyer of reputations. A man whose disappointment alone could cost a restaurant its most valuable clients. No manager wanted to discover what happened when he became truly angry. "I asked for one simple thing," Ethan continued, his voice controlled but unmistakably sharp. "Instead, I've wasted 20 minutes because someone wasn't paying attention." Claire looked at him quietly. She noticed the untouched glass of sparkling water, the unopened leather portfolio beside his chair, the expensive watch on his wrist. More importantly, she noticed the fatigue hidden behind his confidence, the slight tension in his jaw, the restless movement of his fingers against the table. None of it escaped her. The manager finally reached them, breathing harder than he wanted anyone to notice. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm terribly sorry. We'll resolve this immediately." He turned toward Claire with an expression that already carried judgment. "Claire, why don't you step into my office while I personally—" Claire raised one hand politely. Not to interrupt, only to ask for 5 more seconds. The manager hesitated. Ethan folded his arms. The room held its breath. Claire finally met the billionaire's eyes. Her voice never rose above ordinary conversation. In fact, several guests leaned forward because they were afraid of missing a single word. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "people who truly earn respect never have to ask a room to be afraid of them." The sentence floated through the restaurant almost gently. No accusation, no sarcasm, no anger, just quiet certainty. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything anyone could remember. Even the pianist had stopped playing without realizing it. Ethan's expression remained perfectly still. One heartbeat, then another. The confidence on his face didn't disappear. It changed. For the first time in years, someone had answered him without fear, without apology, and without trying to impress him. Across the dining room, an elderly gentleman slowly lowered his newspaper. A woman celebrating her anniversary quietly reached across the table and squeezed her husband's hand. The manager forgot the speech he had prepared. Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a server accidentally dropped a spoon. The tiny metallic sound echoed through the frozen room like thunder. Ethan looked at Claire as though seeing her for the very first time. Not as a waitress, not as an employee, not as another anonymous face moving through another expensive evening. As a person completely unmoved by his fortune, his influence, or the reputation that usually entered every room before he did. Claire remained exactly where she was, calm as still water, waiting not for victory, not for revenge, but simply for the next moment to arrive. None of the people watching could possibly know that this was not the beginning of the story. It was only the moment when everything hidden beneath 2 ordinary lives finally began to surface. The silence lingered for several long seconds before the soft sounds of the restaurant cautiously returned, although nothing felt quite the same anymore. Ethan Blackwood remained standing beside the table, his hand resting lightly on the polished chair, as though he had momentarily forgotten why he had stood in the first place. Claire Bennett simply inclined her head with quiet professionalism. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no trace of triumph. She had spoken exactly one sentence, then allowed the room to decide what it meant. Without another word, she turned gracefully and continued toward another table where an elderly couple had been patiently waiting for fresh coffee. She greeted them with the same warm smile she offered every guest, carefully refilled their cups, and wished them an enjoyable evening, as though the most uncomfortable moment in the restaurant had never happened. Several customers watched her from the corners of their eyes. They expected trembling hands. They expected hurried apologies. Instead, they found steady movements practiced through thousands of long shifts. Claire placed each plate with perfect precision. She remembered every special request without writing a single note. She noticed when a child quietly dropped a napkin before the parents did. She noticed when an older gentleman reached for his reading glasses and gently adjusted the table lamp so the menu became easier to read. Her attention to small details was almost invisible unless someone deliberately looked for it. Most people never did. They only saw the uniform. They never saw the woman wearing it. 3 years earlier, Claire had made a choice that none of her former colleagues had understood. She walked away from a career filled with conference rooms, business travel, and polished presentations, trading expensive heels for practical black shoes that carried her nearly 10 miles across restaurant floors every shift. Friends called it a mistake. Some quietly assumed she had failed. Others believed she had simply disappeared. Claire never corrected them. Some stories were too personal to explain to strangers. Every morning before sunrise, she visited a quiet rehabilitation center on the Upper West Side. Room 214 had become more familiar than her own apartment. Her father, Thomas Bennett, no longer recognized every face that entered, but he always recognized her voice. She would sit beside his window with a paper cup of coffee, read him articles from the newspaper, and remind him about the fishing trips they had taken together when she was a little girl. Some mornings he smiled immediately. Other mornings he simply stared beyond the window as sunlight climbed over the city skyline. Claire never rushed those moments. Patience had become a language she spoke fluently. After each visit, she changed into her restaurant uniform inside a small employee locker room, tied her blonde hair into the same neat ponytail, pinned on her silver name tag, and stepped into another long day without carrying her private worries onto the dining floor. Few coworkers knew anything beyond the simple facts. She always arrived 10 minutes early. She never complained about difficult customers. She quietly traded shifts whenever someone needed help. She never accepted praise as though kindness required applause. Even Daniel Morris, the restaurant manager who had almost sent her home only minutes earlier, often wondered how one employee remained so composed regardless of the pressure surrounding her. Back inside the dining room, Ethan slowly sat down again, but the words Claire had spoken refused to leave his thoughts. He picked up the glass of sparkling water that had started the entire misunderstanding, yet he never took a sip. Across the room, he found himself watching the waitress again, not because she demanded attention, but because she never tried to earn it. She moved through the crowded restaurant with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed strangers to define her worth. For reasons he could not yet explain, Ethan realized that he had become far more interested in the woman he had almost dismissed than in the business meeting that had brought him there in the first place. The dinner meeting resumed only because business demanded it, yet the rhythm of the evening had already shifted in ways no contract could measure. 3 executives joined Ethan Blackwood at the private table near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, each carrying leather portfolios filled with numbers, forecasts, and acquisition strategies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Normally, Ethan controlled every conversation before anyone else spoke. Tonight, however, his attention wandered with surprising frequency. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the opposite side of the dining room, where Claire Bennett continued moving gracefully from table to table. She was never the loudest person in the room, but somehow she had become impossible to ignore. One executive noticed the distraction and smiled politely. "Everything all right, Ethan?" He nodded almost automatically. "Continue." Charts appeared across the table. Revenue projections were discussed. Market expansion plans filled the conversation. Yet each carefully prepared sentence seemed strangely distant compared to the quiet confidence of the waitress who had refused to surrender her dignity only minutes earlier. Ethan had spent 2 decades studying people. Investors, competitors, founders, politicians. He believed every person revealed themselves under pressure. Some became defensive. Some became emotional. Most tried to please whoever held the advantage. Claire had done none of those things. She had remained perfectly calm while standing in front of a room full of strangers who expected her to apologize. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Across the restaurant, Claire quietly delivered another round of desserts. She congratulated a young couple celebrating their engagement. She patiently explained a gluten-free option to another guest. When a little boy accidentally knocked over his lemonade, she immediately knelt beside the table with fresh napkins and reassured the embarrassed child that accidents happen to everyone. The parents thanked her repeatedly. Claire only smiled and wished them a wonderful evening. Kindness came naturally to her because she never treated it like a performance. Daniel Morris watched everything from behind the service station. During his 12 years managing Blackstone House, he had seen countless employees lose their composure after difficult encounters with demanding guests. Claire was different. If anything, she seemed even more focused now than she had been before the confrontation. He quietly approached her while she organized fresh silverware. "Claire." She looked up with the same calm expression. "Yes, Daniel." He hesitated before speaking. "I owe you an apology. I should have asked what happened before assuming you were responsible." Claire gave him a gentle smile that carried no resentment. "You were protecting the restaurant. I understand." Daniel exhaled slowly. Most people would still be angry. Claire folded another linen napkin with careful precision. Holding on to anger takes more energy than letting it go. Daniel stood silently for a moment before walking away, realizing he had just received advice he had unknowingly needed for years. At the far end of the dining room, Ethan witnessed the brief exchange without hearing a single word. Even from a distance, he noticed the manager's posture change after speaking with Claire. It was subtle. His shoulders relaxed. His expression softened. Somehow, within less than a minute, the waitress had calmed another difficult situation without raising her voice. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his untouched steak cooling on the plate before him. One of his associates gently cleared his throat. "You have barely touched your dinner." Ethan looked down almost as if surprised to find the meal still there. "I suppose I have not." The executive chuckled. "That is unusual for you." Ethan allowed himself a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. Unusual. The word lingered in his thoughts. Nothing about Claire Bennett fit the patterns he had spent his career trusting. She worked like someone who expected nothing from the world, yet carried herself like someone who had already discovered everything that truly mattered. As the city lights shimmered beyond the restaurant windows and the pianist returned to a quiet melody, Ethan found himself asking a question he had not asked about anyone in years. Who had Claire Bennett been before she became the woman serving dinner tonight? And what kind of life could teach a person that dignity was worth protecting even when no one else in the room seemed willing to defend it? The evening slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm, but beneath the polished elegance of Blackstone House, something invisible had changed. Conversations became softer. Laughter carried a little more restraint. More than one guest found themselves watching Claire Bennett as though they had only just noticed she had been there all along. She remained completely unaware of the attention. Or perhaps she noticed and simply chose not to acknowledge it. She treated every guest exactly the same. The retired schoolteacher celebrating her 75th birthday received the same warm smile as the hedge fund manager signing a multi-million-dollar agreement. The young couple sharing one dessert because they were saving money received the same respect as the table ordering the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu. Claire had long ago decided that dignity should never depend on the size of a bill. As she carried a tray toward the kitchen, another server quietly stepped beside her. Emily Carter had worked with Claire for nearly 2 years and knew better than anyone how unusual she was. "How are you still smiling?" Emily whispered. "If someone had spoken to me like that, I would have gone home." Claire carefully placed the empty glasses onto the service counter before answering. People usually speak from whatever they are carrying inside. It is not always about the person standing in front of them. Emily shook her head with a small laugh. "You always say things that make me feel like I should be taking notes." Claire smiled gently. "I am still learning too." Their conversation ended as another order appeared in the kitchen window. Every movement resumed with practiced efficiency. Plates disappeared. New dishes arrived. Timers chimed softly behind the swinging doors. The scent of fresh rosemary, butter, and warm bread drifted through the air. At table 12, Ethan's business meeting finally reached its conclusion. One by one, the executives gathered their portfolios and stood. Handshakes were exchanged. Promises of follow-up calls filled the air. Within minutes, Ethan found himself sitting alone for the first time that evening. Normally, he welcomed silence after negotiations. It gave him space to think 3 steps ahead. Tonight, his thoughts refused to focus on business. Instead, they returned again and again to a waitress whose composure had quietly dismantled every assumption he had made about her. He reached for the leather check presenter that had just been placed beside his untouched dessert. Instead of opening it, he looked toward the dining room once more. Claire was helping an elderly gentleman into his coat before holding the restaurant door open as he thanked her with obvious gratitude. She waited until he safely stepped onto the sidewalk before returning inside, never expecting recognition for a gesture that lasted only a few seconds. Ethan had spent much of his adult life surrounded by people eager to impress him. Consultants arrived with polished presentations. Executives praised his decisions before meetings even began. Investors carefully measured every sentence in hopes of earning his approval. Claire had done exactly the opposite. She had not attempted to flatter him. She had not apologized simply because of his wealth. Most surprisingly, she had not seemed interested in changing his opinion of her at all. That realization lingered in his mind. It was unfamiliar. It was uncomfortable. It was also strangely refreshing. Daniel Morris approached Ethan's table carrying the final receipt. "Mr. Blackwood, I would once again like to apologize for everything that happened earlier." Ethan looked up slowly. "Tell me something honestly, Daniel." "Of course. How long has Claire Bennett worked here?" Daniel seemed surprised by the question. "Almost 3 years. Has she always been like this?" Daniel smiled. Before answering, "Every single day. She treats the dishwasher with the same respect she gives our wealthiest guests. She has never asked for special treatment. She has never spoken badly about anyone behind their back. The staff trusts her because she never asks anyone to do something she would not gladly do herself." Ethan remained quiet. Daniel continued, "I almost made a serious mistake tonight because I assumed your version of events had to be the correct one. She never reminded me of that. She simply went back to work." Ethan lowered his eyes to the untouched receipt. For the first time in years, he wondered whether success had slowly surrounded him with people who agreed too quickly and questioned too little. Across the restaurant, Claire picked up another tray and disappeared through the kitchen doors, completely unaware that the quiet example she set every day had already begun changing someone who had once believed respect could be earned through power alone. The restaurant slowly emptied as the evening drew closer to closing time. The golden glow from the chandeliers softened, reflecting against polished glasses that had witnessed hundreds of conversations, but very few moments worth remembering. Servers quietly reset tables for the following day. Chairs slid gently beneath white linen cloths. The pianist packed away his sheet music with the calm satisfaction of another successful performance. Claire Bennett carried the final dessert tray into the kitchen, thanked the pastry chef for staying a few extra minutes, and began helping another server polish silverware without being asked. She had finished her assigned section nearly 20 minutes earlier, yet leaving while someone else remained overwhelmed had never felt right to her. Small acts of kindness were rarely noticed, but she had stopped measuring their value by whether anyone was watching. Ethan Blackwood remained seated near the window long after every member of his business team had departed. The check still rested unopened beside his coffee cup. He found himself observing the restaurant in a way he never had before. Usually he noticed efficiency, presentation, and service standards because those details reflected management. Tonight he noticed people. He watched a dishwasher laugh quietly with a line cook after surviving another demanding dinner rush. He watched Daniel Morris thank every employee individually before they clocked out. Most of all, he watched Claire moving naturally through every corner of the restaurant, offering encouragement without ever drawing attention to herself. It was leadership without authority, influence without titles, something he had spent years trying to teach executives through expensive seminars. Yet here it appeared effortlessly inside a woman carrying folded aprons instead of financial reports. Daniel approached Claire near the service station. You can head home if you would like. We are finished here. Claire glanced toward another young server struggling to organize stacked wine glasses. Give me 5 more minutes. Daniel smiled knowingly. I thought you might say that. Ethan quietly overheard the exchange. 5 minutes later, Claire helped the younger employee finish the task, wished everyone a safe trip home, collected her worn canvas tote bag from the employee locker, and changed into a simple navy sweater beneath a light gray coat. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance outside the uniform. No designer handbag, no expensive jewelry, no attempt to impress anyone. She looked like thousands of ordinary New Yorkers walking home after long shifts. Yet somehow she carried herself with a quiet confidence that expensive things could never purchase. As Claire stepped toward the front entrance, Ethan finally stood from his table. Daniel noticed immediately. Mr. Blackwood, is there anything else I can do for you this evening? Ethan looked toward the departing waitress before answering. Actually, yes. Daniel waited politely. Ethan hesitated, an unfamiliar pause for a man accustomed to immediate decisions. Earlier tonight, I made assumptions before asking questions. Daniel nodded slowly. I believe we both did. Ethan looked down for a brief moment. Does Claire know that? Daniel smiled faintly. She probably does. Whether she expects you to say it is another matter. Ethan picked up the leather check presenter, signed the receipt, and quietly left a generous gratuity for the entire staff rather than directing it toward any single person. It felt less like generosity and more like recognition. As he stepped outside, cool autumn air greeted him. The sounds of Manhattan filled the evening with distant traffic, footsteps, and quiet conversations drifting along the sidewalk. Ahead, Claire walked toward the subway entrance carrying the same canvas bag over one shoulder, blending almost completely into the crowd. Ethan could have returned to the waiting town car, where his driver patiently stood beside the open rear door. Instead, he remained still beneath the restaurant awning, watching her disappear among ordinary people living ordinary lives. He suddenly realized that despite controlling billion-dollar companies, he knew almost nothing about the quiet strength required to keep showing kindness every day without expecting applause. For the first time in many years, the next decision he wanted to make had nothing to do with business. He wanted to understand the story behind the woman who had changed the direction of his entire evening with nothing more than calm words and unwavering dignity. Claire descended the subway stairs with the same steady pace she carried through every part of her day. The evening rush had begun to thin, leaving scattered commuters reading books, scrolling through their phones, or quietly watching the train windows reflect tired faces. She found an empty seat near the center of the car and rested her canvas bag on her lap. Inside were only a neatly folded sweater, a paperback novel she had been reading for nearly a month because she rarely had time to finish more than a few pages each night, and a small envelope containing receipts from the rehabilitation center. She glanced at the envelope for only a second before slipping it deeper into the bag. Tomorrow morning would bring another payment, another conversation with the billing office, and another reminder that caring for someone you loved often required sacrifices nobody else could see. She closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to enjoy the rare comfort of stillness between one responsibility and the next. Across the city, Ethan Blackwood sat alone inside the back of his town car, while Manhattan passed beyond the tinted windows in a blur of lights and reflections. His driver had asked twice whether they should return to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. Ethan answered neither time. Instead, he stared at the business card Daniel Morris had quietly handed him before leaving the restaurant. It contained nothing more than Claire Bennett's first and last name, written neatly beneath the restaurant logo because every employee carried identical identification cards. Ethan had requested no address, no private information, no background report. Years earlier, he would have instructed an assistant to prepare a complete file before sunrise. Tonight, something stopped him. Claire had earned his curiosity through honesty. Investigating her life without permission suddenly felt like another form of arrogance. He slipped the card into his wallet beside photographs of board members and investment contacts that suddenly seemed strangely unimportant. The following morning arrived with pale autumn sunlight stretching across the city skyline. Claire followed the same routine she had repeated for nearly 3 years. Before work, she stopped at a neighborhood bakery, purchased 1 blueberry muffin and 2 cups of coffee, then walked 6 blocks to the rehabilitation center. The receptionist smiled the moment she entered. "Good morning, Claire." She smiled back. "Good morning, Mrs. Lewis. How is my father today?" "Better than yesterday. He has been asking whether the Yankees won." Claire laughed softly. "Then I already know the first conversation we are going to have." She entered room 214 and found Thomas Bennett sitting quietly beside the window, wrapped in a light gray blanket, while morning sunlight rested across his shoulders. His memory was unpredictable. Some days he recognized every detail of her childhood. Other days he struggled to remember what month it was. This morning he looked toward her and smiled immediately. "There is my favorite girl." Claire's eyes brightened. "I brought your favorite muffin. You always remember." She placed the coffee on the small bedside table and carefully broke the muffin into smaller pieces exactly the way he preferred. They spoke about baseball, the changing leaves in Central Park, and the sound of rain against the windows the previous night. Not once did Claire mention the confrontation at the restaurant. Not once did she describe the billionaire whose words had briefly shaken an entire dining room. Those moments belonged to yesterday. Her father deserved today. Several miles away, Ethan entered the headquarters of Blackwood Capital, where glass walls reflected the confidence expected from everyone who worked there. Assistants greeted him. Executives waited outside the boardroom. Financial updates filled his calendar from morning until evening. Yet before stepping into the first meeting, he quietly asked his executive assistant one unexpected question. "Have we ever sponsored rehabilitation centers in New York City?" She looked surprised. "Only a few through our charitable foundation." "Would you like the reports?" Ethan paused for a moment before nodding. "Yes. Bring them to my office this afternoon." It was a simple request, yet even he did not fully understand why he had made it. Somewhere beneath the pressure of quarterly earnings and acquisition strategies, the memory of a quiet waitress carrying invisible burdens had begun changing the questions he asked about the world around him. The afternoon unfolded beneath a clear October sky as sunlight reflected from the glass towers surrounding Blackwood Capital. Ethan sat alone in his office overlooking Midtown Manhattan, yet the view that usually inspired ambition now felt strangely distant. A stack of reports rested neatly on his desk. Quarterly earnings had exceeded expectations. A major acquisition was ready for final approval. His assistant had highlighted every document requiring his signature. Normally, he would have finished the entire stack before lunch. Today, his attention paused on a much thinner folder placed quietly on top. The cover simply read Community Partnerships. He opened it without urgency. The first pages summarized charitable donations made through the company's foundation over the past 5 years. Scholarships, food banks, veterans programs, youth education. Near the back of the folder, one name quietly caught his attention. Riverside Rehabilitation Center. Ethan recognized it immediately from the report his assistant had prepared that morning. The foundation had provided a modest grant nearly 18 months earlier to help modernize patient therapy equipment. Curious, he continued reading until a handwritten thank you letter appeared between 2 printed pages. The letter had been scanned for company records after arriving by mail. It was not written by an executive director or fundraising consultant. It came from the daughter of a patient. She thanked the foundation for helping people she believed the world had forgotten. She wrote that every new piece of equipment represented another chance for someone to recover a little more independence and another reason for families to keep believing tomorrow might be better than yesterday. There was no request for additional money, no attempt to flatter donors, only gratitude expressed with remarkable sincerity. Ethan noticed the signature at the bottom. Claire Bennett. He slowly read the letter a second time, then a third. The words carried the same quiet honesty he had heard inside the restaurant. She had never mentioned the foundation. She had never hinted that his company had unknowingly touched her family's life. She had certainly never used it to change his opinion after their confrontation. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared through the office windows while the realization settled inside him. She had possessed information that could have immediately shifted the balance between them, yet she had chosen silence over advantage. That choice impressed him more than any impressive resume ever could. Across the city, Claire finished helping her father complete a short physical therapy session before saying goodbye with a warm embrace. As she walked toward the reception desk, Mrs. Lewis called her over with a cheerful smile. Someone from the Blackwood Foundation telephoned this morning. Claire looked surprised. Really? They asked whether the rehabilitation center still had unmet Equipment needs. I told them there is always something we need. Claire smiled politely, but thought little more about it. Charitable organizations occasionally checked on previous grants. She assumed it was routine. After leaving the center, she stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to buy fresh fruit, oatmeal, and her father's favorite herbal tea before taking the subway toward work. Her life continued according to the same quiet rhythm that had shaped the past 3 years. Responsibility first. Everything else later. Meanwhile, Ethan closed the folder and pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Rebecca, could you come in for a moment?" His assistant entered carrying a tablet. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." He slid the folder across the desk. "Increase the Rehabilitation Center grant this quarter." Rebecca nodded while making a note. "How much would you like to approve?" Ethan thought for only a moment. "Enough to finish the therapy wing they have been postponing." She looked up, surprised by both the speed and generosity of the decision. "Would you like the donation announced publicly?" Ethan gently shook his head. "No press release. No interviews. No photographs. Just send the funds." Rebecca smiled with quiet respect. "I will take care of it immediately." After she left, Ethan remained alone once again. For years he had believed generosity became meaningful only when it created measurable impact. Claire had quietly shown him another truth without ever intending to teach it. The most meaningful acts often happened when no one expected recognition. Somewhere beyond the city skyline, the woman who had challenged his pride with one calm sentence continued living exactly as she always had, completely unaware that the example of her ordinary kindness was steadily reshaping the heart of a man who had once measured nearly everything by power alone. 2 evenings later, the familiar glow of Blackstone House welcomed another full dining room as autumn rain shimmered across the sidewalks outside. Claire Bennett adjusted the cuff of her black uniform, tied her apron with practiced hands, and quietly reviewed the evening reservations with the rest of the staff. Nothing about the schedule suggested this night would be different from dozens before it. She greeted guests with the same warm professionalism, memorized special requests before anyone repeated them, and moved through the restaurant with calm efficiency that seemed to slow the hurried pace around her. Near 7 o'clock, the front doors opened once again. Daniel Morris looked up from the reservation desk and recognized the familiar figure immediately. Ethan Blackwood stepped inside wearing a navy overcoat, still carrying tiny drops of rain across the shoulders. This time he arrived alone. No executives, no assistants, no security detail, only a single reservation under his own name. Daniel welcomed him with a courteous smile. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan returned the greeting with unexpected warmth. "Good evening, Daniel." The manager noticed the difference instantly. There was no impatience in his voice, no expectation that the room should rearrange itself around him. Daniel escorted him to the same window table he had occupied earlier that week. As Ethan removed his coat, his eyes naturally searched the dining room until they found Claire speaking softly with an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. She was smiling at something the husband had said, and for a brief moment the years seemed lighter on both of their faces simply because she had chosen to listen. Ethan watched quietly before turning his attention back to the menu. Several minutes later, Claire approached his table carrying a water pitcher. She recognized him immediately, though nothing in her expression suggested surprise or hesitation. She simply offered the same professional smile she extended to every guest. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. Welcome back." Ethan stood before she could pour the water. It was a small gesture, yet it caught the attention of Daniel across the room because very few guests ever stood to greet their server. Claire looked at him with mild curiosity. Ethan took a slow breath, fully aware that several nearby tables had begun watching without pretending otherwise. "Before we begin," he said quietly, "there is something I should have said the other night." Claire remained silent, giving him space to continue. Ethan met her eyes without looking away. "I judged you before I knew you. I raised my voice when I should have asked a question. I allowed my position to become more important than another person's dignity. I was wrong, and I am sincerely sorry." The surrounding conversations faded almost naturally, not because anyone had been asked to listen, but because genuine humility carried farther than anger ever could. Claire studied him for a brief moment. She searched his expression not for perfection, but for honesty. What she found there made her shoulders relax almost imperceptibly. A gentle smile appeared. "Thank you for saying that. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No lecture. No attempt to make the moment larger than it needed to be. Her forgiveness arrived with the same quiet grace that had shaped every other part of her life. Ethan felt something inside him settle for the first time in days. "May I ask you one question?" he said. Claire nodded. "Of course. Why did you not tell me that my foundation had helped your father's rehabilitation center?" Claire glanced toward the rain streaking softly across the restaurant windows before answering. "Because kindness loses something when it becomes a negotiation. You did not owe me respect because of a donation. You owed every person respect simply because they are people." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. The words landed with remarkable simplicity. She had reduced a lesson he had overlooked for years into one quiet sentence. Daniel, watching from the front of the restaurant, realized that no management seminar, leadership conference, or corporate retreat could have taught the billionaire what one ordinary waitress had just expressed without ever trying to teach it all. Claire smiled politely once more and opened her order book. "Now, would you like to hear tonight's specials?" Ethan returned the smile, lighter than it had been in years. "Yes," he answered softly. "This time, I would like to listen first." The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that neither Claire Bennett nor Ethan Blackwood had expected. They did not become close friends overnight, and their lives continued along very different paths. Claire still arrived at Blackstone House before every evening shift, greeting each co-worker by name, helping where she was needed, and carrying herself with the same quiet grace that had always defined her. Ethan continued leading one of the most successful investment firms in the country, making difficult decisions, attending board meetings, and navigating the relentless pace of corporate life. Yet something essential had changed in the spaces no financial report could ever measure. He listened longer before speaking. He asked questions before forming conclusions. More than once, his senior executives noticed that meetings once dominated by his opinions had become conversations where every voice was invited to contribute. Nobody inside the company knew exactly when the change had begun. They only knew the atmosphere slowly became different. Several months later, the Rehabilitation Center held a small ceremony to celebrate the opening of its newly completed therapy wing. There were no television cameras, no elaborate speeches, and no oversized donation check displayed for publicity. A modest plaque near the entrance simply thanked the Blackwood Foundation for helping families continue believing in recovery. Claire stood beside her father as physical therapists welcomed patients into brighter treatment rooms filled with modern equipment. Thomas Bennett looked around with quiet amazement before turning toward his daughter. "There are still good people in the world," he said softly. Claire smiled as she squeezed his hand. "There always have been." Standing near the back of the room, Ethan chose to remain unnoticed. He had accepted the invitation only after learning that the event was intended for patients rather than donors. When Thomas finally recognized him from the restaurant, he slowly extended his hand with genuine gratitude. Ethan accepted it warmly. "Your daughter has taught me far more than I could ever teach her," he admitted. Thomas smiled knowingly. "She has been teaching me that my whole life." Claire looked from one man to the other before quietly changing the subject to her father's progress in therapy. She never seemed interested in becoming the center of attention, even when every conversation naturally returned to her. That afternoon, as guests gradually departed, Ethan and Claire found themselves walking toward the building's entrance together. Crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves through the nearby trees. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Ethan finally smiled. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Claire nodded gently. "I do." He looked toward the city skyline stretching beyond the park. "I have repeated those words to myself more times than I can count." Claire laughed quietly. Then perhaps they found the person who needed them. Ethan shook his head with a grateful smile. They certainly did. A city bus rolled past while families walked along the sidewalk enjoying the cool afternoon. Nothing about the moment appeared extraordinary to anyone passing by. There was no dramatic celebration, no grand declaration. Only two ordinary people whose lives had briefly crossed at exactly the right time. Claire adjusted the strap of her familiar canvas bag before preparing to leave. "My shift starts in an hour," she said. "People are probably already waiting for dinner." Ethan smiled. "Then I should not keep them waiting." She wished him a pleasant afternoon and walked toward the subway station with the same steady pace she had always carried, disappearing naturally into the flow of everyday life. Ethan remained where he was for another minute, watching until the crowd gently carried her from view. He understood now that real greatness rarely announced itself with wealth, titles, or applause. Sometimes it wore a simple waitress uniform, carried a canvas bag, and spoke only when kindness required a voice. Years later, people inside Blackwood Capital would quietly say that the company became stronger when its leader finally learned to listen. They would never know that the lesson had begun inside a restaurant, not during a board meeting, and that the most valuable investment Ethan Blackwood ever made required no contract, no negotiation, and no money at all. It began the moment one ordinary woman refused to surrender her dignity, proving that respect is never won by raising a voice, but by quietly raising the standard for everyone in the room.